Hey, everybody, people can hear me. I've got an internet connection, but give everybody a massive. I'm Ali, I'm the Executive Canada, and I'm from Montreal, where I'm attending a global conference on biodiversity. I'm on the traditional lands of the Hawk people, unceded tradition, and I really want to thank them for me, but the 12,000 other conference in addition to all. It's time to be here, and Ross, who's you all know, is event for us. Hey
everybody.
Am I super?
I had to. You're a bit choppy there, Ali. So I had to just pop on and say, "What's up?" I think I imagine my internet connection is a bit better. So yeah, welcome everybody to this Protect Our Winters Nerdy About Nature live nature walk here. This is going to be super fun. Got a really cool video for you and some Q&A stuff lined up. We're just going to kind of wait a minute here and let some people kind of continue to log on. We're using a new platform that no one here has ever used before. So if we could have somebody test it out, like by just writing some comments, maybe saying, hey, letting us know where you're from, and so we can see if that's showing up here in our comments thing, so we can answer questions efficiently when it's the Q&A time. So y'all want to help us with that? That would be lovely. Ali, was there anything else you would like to try and say here?
I focus in a little bit on the first top. Yeah, so that's awesome. Just really to say that organizations like observer status and that the audience events like this to show us that you care about the petition that we've got going. Ross is helping us out with will be the Environment Minister at the end of. Massively appreciated that Forest today, because I know my internet connection, guys.
Okay, Ali, I think you're just too glitchy to really talk, unfortunately. That dang Montreal internet. All right, well, I think you said something along the lines of this being a new campaign for Protect Our Winters. And yeah, like I'm pretty sure she mentioned, I'm here doing some work to help kind of spread this message. And today with us as well, we're going to be joined by Natalie Knowles, who is the leader of the Science Alliance here for Protect Our Winters. Natalie, welcome. Hey.
Thanks for having me, Ross. Great to be here.
And Ali, I'm just going to go ahead and turn your camera off because you're glitchy. Hasta luego. How are you doing, Nat?
Doing great. Here in Jasper, Alberta.
Nice. Yeah, I'm joining everybody here from this little town of Ucluelet out on Vancouver Island on the traditional land of the Ucluelet Nation, and pretty stoked to be here. Like I've mentioned, this is my first live, so I don't know what I'm doing, but we're just winging it. Yeah, I don't know. What do you guys reckon? You think we should start this?
I think we should get it started.
Now, would you like to say anything about biodiversity campaign or anything happening here in Canada?
No, I think we're just really excited for biodiversity, important project that Protect Our Winters is. It's super related to climate change and the connectivity and having nature work with us and not working against nature is a big business. So it's exciting to draw these connections between climate and I'm excited to have you here and explore diversity and fun outdoors.
We are experiencing some internet issues, it sounds like. Yeah, it sounds like, Nat, you're a bit choppy as well. Yeah, it sounds like we're also getting spammed on YouTube right now by some bots on the comment section. That's always hilarious. All right, well, so I think I'm just going to go ahead and jump into this. So this is going to be a nature walk that I've got pre-recorded here, so it's live but pre-recorded, but then we're going to do breaks in between so that we can have some Q&As here and kind of further the discussion about biodiversity. And so before we get into it, I'm used to doing these nature walks on like 3-4 hour time spans where I just kind of have time to meander about with folks and chit chat about a bunch of stuff. And I found it to be really difficult to kind of say everything and try to make it into a concise little 15-minute chunks here. So it'll be like an hour in total. So there are a couple things that I didn't fully explain in this nature walk so far that I'd like to just open with as some sort of like prerequisite understanding here. So first off is the concept of photosynthesis, which I'm sure all of you know about, like loosely, you know what photosynthesis is, but I would just like to loosely explain again that it's the process that trees, plants, all sorts of different photosynthesizing things that can be, certain bacteria and lichen and things, they photosynthesize using chlorophyll in the chloroplast of the cells, and it basically takes the energy from the sun to break apart CO2, storing the carbon as sugars within the tree, so that's what it uses to grow and create big heartwood, and then it releases the oxygen molecules, which becomes air, and we breathe that, so that's lovely. So all that stored carbon then goes down into the rest of the tree, and that's kind of what they use to grow. And then that is done through what's known as the phloem layer in vascular plants. And the phloem consists of two different organs. One is called the xylem, and the cambium layer in vascular plants. That consists of two different organs, the xylem and the phloem. So the xylem carries the water up from the root system, and the phloem carries the carbohydrates and sugars down and stores that in the wood of the plant. So that's just a couple little things that I forgot to mention here. And with that being said, we've got just over 20 folks here, which isn't huge, but we're going to jump into it now. So yeah, get ready for the first chunk of this nature walk here, and then we'll meet back in 15 minutes and have a Q&A session with Natalie and I. All right, here we go.
Wow, what a beautiful snowy day out here on the coast of Vancouver Island. I'm currently in the town of Ucluelet on the traditional lands of the Ucluelet Nation. And this is an area that doesn't see snow that often, so I guess for this Protect Our Winters nature walk, I decided to dump POW last night. Pretty incredible, because this is an old growth coastal western hemlock forest here that we don't tend to see covered in snow that often, so it gives us a really cool glimpse at these old growth forests blanketed in snow. How beautiful is that? So today I'm going to be talking with all of you about biodiversity, because it's a relevant subject these days. We've got the UN Biodiversity Summit happening in Montreal right now, and Canada has recently agreed to protect 30% of its land and water resources by 2030, which is a huge deal because Canada is, as you're all probably aware, a very big country. So it makes up So within Canada, we have a quarter of the world's boreal forest, a quarter of the world's wetlands. We have 20% of the world's freshwater resources, and we have the largest coastline out of anywhere in the world. So committing to protecting 30% of all that is a pretty big deal, and it's a pretty important thing. So today I'm going to talk about why biodiversity is important. And biodiversity in general is something that tends to increase over time in any given ecosystem. It tends to get more complex as time goes on, as things layer and build upon one another. And this is true whether you're in a wetland, a desert, high alpine area, high desert plateau, or high montane plateaus, more interior, or out here on the coast. So I'm going to be using this ecosystem to kind of talk about these concepts of biodiversity. But note that this is something that applies to all these different regions, wherever you might live. You'll also have to just, little asterisks here, apologize for me if this is kind of awkward. I'm used to like addressing like a group of people in these nature walk settings, but right now it's just me and my buddy Ben holding the camera. So I'm not able to like read your voices and faces and stuff, but we'll stop a couple points throughout this nature walk and have some Q&As with me back live on a computer, wherever I am doing this when this airs. So I think the main thing that I would like to start with here is this concept of change, because change is a constant in life. We're all feeling it in our own individual lives, but it happens out there in the real world, out in our resources. Oh, check it out. There's a red-headed sapsucker. I don't know if you can see this. This is a tangent. If you come this way. This is part of Nature Walk. Sometimes you don't know what you're gonna get. Oh, it just flew over to this cedar here. Anyway, red-headed sapsucker out here while I'm talking about biodiversity, really important bird within these ecosystems. What was I talking about, Ben? I was talking about change. So change is a constant in life, and we're all experiencing it at all times. So all these ecosystems are in this constant state of flux and change, and all these different species within these ecosystems all play their own specific role. They all have a niche to fill that allows them to grow and succeed, and not only for themselves to succeed as a species and spread their seed to the next generation, but they'll help everything else in these ecosystems function. And this collectively is what gives these ecosystems what's known as ecological function. And this is everything from purifying the air and water we drink to mitigating the soils and landslides, flooding, all sorts of different ecological functions that this bounty of species in a single ecosystem provides. 12,000 years ago, where I'm currently standing right now was covered in about 1 kilometer of ice, I think 2 kilometers deep in ice of some places during this interglacial period. And when that glacier started to retreat about 12,000 years ago, the first species to kind of inhabit this area were lichen, which were these tiny amalgamation of fungi and bacteria that live together that fix nitrogen and are able to pull nitrogen out of the air and start to create some sort of soil that other things can grow in. The second was a variety of different deciduous trees like red alder, such as this beautiful tree right here. It's even more beautiful, covered in snow. Check out this bark. An interesting little fun fact about red alders is that this bark here is actually more naturally kind of dark gray green, but it gets all these white splotches on it, and this is actually a lichen that lives specifically on alder that gives it this kind of white splotchy color that we so commonly associate with red alder. But so red alder is a really key pioneer species in these areas after some sort of disturbance, or again during that initial glacial retreat that first exposed all these rocky boundary, all the rocky boulders and the kind of substrate that we are currently standing on right now. So before I kind of move forward with that, I just like to kind of rewind and just give a brief summary of 2 different species of trees or plant types that live in these areas. So first you have coniferous trees, or gymnosperms technically, and then you have deciduous trees or angiosperms, flowering plants. These are 2 different kind of classes of plants. Now the gymnosperms are ones that evolved earlier. These kind of evolved from mosses and ferns that are able to kind of withstand a wide breadth of forces. And so conifer trees or gymnosperms reproduce with an open seed or an exposed seed, and the fancy thing about them that makes them really adaptable in these different niches, and especially alpine tundra ones like we have all throughout Canada, is that they have these needles here, like this western hemlock here, that are really waxy, durable, and they're really kind of energy intensive, energy expensive to make. So these trees will spend a lot of their energy producing these, expensive needles, these expensive leaves, if you will, that allows them to photosynthesize year round, because these needles here are really durable. And again, they're able to withstand cold temperatures. They're able to withstand, freezing winds, where they're able to trap moisture just a little bit easier than, say, a deciduous tree like this alder here, which currently doesn't have any of its leaves. Now, this is a different adaptive strategy that deciduous trees have taken. Oh, just keep getting pow shots to the face here. Different adaptive strategy that deciduous trees have taken on that allows them to, instead of creating those really energy intensive, dense, waxy covered needles that are able to withstand the winters, they just produce these really lightweight, flimsy, deciduous leaves that are able to photosynthesize really well in the summertime, soak up a bunch of that light, and then turn that into their heartwood. And then in the wintertime, they drop those leaves because those leaves are going to freeze anyway, and then it provides, or it creates surface area which will collect snow, and it's not the strongest of wood. So anyway, these two different adaptive strategies. You have deciduous trees on one hand that spend their time creating cheap, energy efficient, photosynthesizing leaves that are able to do really well in the summertime, then they drop those for the winter. Then you have coniferous trees which are able to have more expensive, intensive leaves to create, but are able to withstand a wider range of temperatures and conditions within that. Now, then there are also wiggly species, such as like, broad-leafed evergreen trees or bushes like this salal here, that has a leaf that's very similar to deciduous trees, but it's very waxy, very durable, able to withstand a lot of salt spray and colder temperatures, so they're able to survive throughout the winter as well. Same with evergreen huckleberry here. It's so beautiful, covered in snow. Look at that. Again, very durable, evergreen type leaves. Yeah, gorgeous. And then on the flip side of that, if you're somewhere more interior, you're going to have trees like western larches, which are technically a conifer tree, reproducing in little bunches of up to, I think it's 5 to 20 needles on larches, and then they're going to drop those in the winter time. So they're kind of like a bare conifer tree that looks like it's dead, but that's just a different adaptive strategy. So the thing with deciduous trees that makes them really cool is when they come in and they enter these new areas, these pioneer species coming into new areas after disturbance, or when the ice sheet recedes, they're able to synthesize atmospheric nitrogen from the air by working symbiotically with a bacteria that lives in the root nodules, known as Frankia, that's able to basically pull the nitrogen from the air, synthesize it, send it up to the tree so that it can create chlorophyll, which it uses to photosynthesize, a really important thing for photosynthesizing. So it creates chlorophyll in its leaves, and then in the fall when it drops those leaves, it does super early. It does when they're still green. They don't even have a chance to change colors. So the leaves fall when they're still green, and then there they biodegrade, being broken down by insects, fungi, all sorts of little mites that eat them up and redistribute that nitrogen in that chlorophyll back to create a soil and a rich humus layer that allows everything else to grow, because trees like these western hemlocks here, these giant western red cedars here, all require a lot of nitrogen in order to grow and thrive, but they don't have that same symbiotic relationship with the bacteria that alder does. So alder, again, plays a really important role here in coming into these ecosystems after disturbance, again, fulfilling its niche within this ecosystem, so that trees like the cedar, these hemlocks, the spruces back there, there's some lodgepole pines, shore pines around here that can grow, as well as all the different medley of understory that you see throughout here. God, it's just so gorgeous covered in snow. I can't get over that. So I keep mentioning 12,000 years ago, this area having just been blanketed in glacier and none of these tree species existing here. A really cool fun fact is that Douglas firs, which are a really common tree all throughout interior British Columbia, not right out here on the coast, but just interior on the island they are, and really famous tree for lumber, great fast growing tree. Those actually didn't exist up here until they were able to migrate from further south in Mexico after that glacier retreated about 12,000 years ago. And if you think about how long that takes, this goes back to the idea of change. Like, change is constant, but a tree migrating up an entire continent like that, every tree species kind of varies depending on when they reach maturity and when they start dropping their cones and how long those cones take to seed and when they're a viable source of future seed, yada yada, all this stuff. But on average, trees migrate about 100 meters every year. So if you think about that, that's 10 years to migrate maybe a kilometer if conditions are right, and then to move up the entire continent, like that takes an incredibly long period of time. Again, it takes a lot of stability in these ecosystems for them to adapt to that change and migrate up from Mexico all the way up to here. And then there was a mini ice age that pushed them down and separated them into different subspecies of Douglas firs. You've got interior Douglas. We don't need to go into any of that, but that's just a cool fun fact. So basically, these trees, we think of them as stagnant in these ecosystems, but they are too, migrating and moving with the climate as things change slowly over long periods of time. Now, throughout this kind of long-winded rant of mine here, I've mentioned different pioneer species and disturbances. So every ecosystem has some sort of different disturbance regime, something that stirs the pot, if you will, that kind of mixes things up and allows for different species to kind of thrive at a certain point and then, kind of recede as other species kind of take over in this sort of varying hierarchy of different plants fulfilling different niches and roles within an ecosystem. So in, desert environments, that could be something like, random floods that come through. You have like flash floods that can come through and alter an ecosystem. You have in wetlands area, there's all sorts of different flooding events. More interior BC, fires actually play a huge role in disturbance events that can clear broad swaths of land. And those forest ecosystems in the interior are kind of adapted to specifically manage all these different types of disturbances. So in interior, those forests in BC, you know, what would have been typically ponderosa pines separated by lots of space, big old trees. When a fire would come through, it would burn the understory, but not touch any of the big kind of matriarchal trees there, which would allow future regeneration of those same ponderosa pines, which are really not very shade tolerant, so they require a lot of sunlight in order to survive. So all these kind of different ecosystems have these nuances to different disturbances that are able to dictate basically the way things kind of ebb and flow and grow. Now out here in this coastal forest, we don't have fires. There's actually never been a historical fire recorded in these forest ecosystems. So the disturbances out here tend to be much smaller. Things like wind throw, maybe a little landslide at times. You have disease trees that can come in, and all this does is it clears gaps in the forest canopy that allows sunlight to come in and reach the understory to reach some of these smaller trees that are kind of growing out in the understory. So when we talk about forest succession after big disturbances or after a big glacial retreat, the first ones that are going to come in are these nitrogen fixers like alders, things that are able to kind of regrow and rebuild a soil layer that allows other species to come in. From there, you're going to have more sun tolerant species. So more interior, again, this is going to be species like Douglas fir or pine even. Love a lot of open sunlight, but they don't do well once that canopy is established. They tend to not reseed because their saplings are going to be growing in a shady environment that's not good for them. And in that case, you have many shade tolerant species like western hemlock and western red cedar here, which are able to come in, and these forests tend to be the climax trees of tend to be the dominant trees of a climax forest. So in this case, if we look over here, we can see that we have this big western red cedar right here. It's kind of grown and established over hundreds of years. That's probably a 600 to 800-year-old western red cedar there. And then we've got another kind of scraggly one there. And then we have this dead tree in the middle. Now this dead tree in the middle with all those kind of witch's broom spires is a dead western hemlock. And you can see the top is snapped off there. And then we've got a plate fungi growing off the top of that there. So what has happened here is that this big western hemlock grew in a shaded environment, grew to be one of the dominant trees of this forest canopy, but then it got infected by disease or parasitic plants like mistletoe, which create those kind of witch's broom things on the end of those branches, and it slowly killed this tree. So now that this tree is dead, its branches are dropped off, its leaves have all dropped off, and then now all these different younger cedars and hemlocks here in the understory are able to get light, and they're able to photosynthesize and grow to fill that gap in the canopy. So this is part of forest succession of different things kind of growing and dying and evolving in this always changing, always growing, always shifting ecosystem. Pretty dang neat. So there's a lot going on here, a lot to talk about. I know I haven't done the best job explaining it because I'm trying to keep this tight and condensed, but I'm going to throw it back to myself at my computer now for some Q&As with you. So feel free to hit me up with any questions you got.
Wow, that was just exhilarating, don't you all think? Oh, the modern world today. How good is technology? Yeah, if anybody has any questions, feel free to write into the chat. We have one question here. Let me just see how I can make this pop up so we can answer it. Does this work? God, this is just slick as. So Simon asked a question. Why do we have so many terms for seemingly the same thing? Coniferous equals softwood equals evergreen equals gymnosperm. Yeah, this is... it's complex. Basically, like all these different words here kind of refer to the same type of tree, but they all mean many different things. And it just so happens that a lot of the trees that we have actually just fit that description. So, for example, a coniferous tree is a tree that reproduces via cone. And these are all typically gymnosperms. I'm trying to think of like an example. So like a Pacific yew, I mean, I guess that's a Pacific yew is technically a gymnosperm. I guess it's technically still coniferous too, but it doesn't really reproduce with a cone. It has this like a little seed in a fleshy aril. So it kind of looks like a berry. Birds love these berries. Yew berries are a big staple food source for all sorts of different birds within our ecosystems here. But at the same time, it's not a deciduous tree or like a fruiting tree like an angiosperm. So a coniferous tree is a tree that reproduces with cones versus a tree reproducing with fruit. Softwood refers to, again, mostly it refers to coniferous trees, and this is actually a term that derives from old logging industry stuff. So like pine trees have a much softer wood than a hardwood, which like back in the day, old silviculture, it was known for like oaks and things where you had like really dense wood. And so they just kind of made these loose classifications where deciduous trees tend to be called hardwoods, even though some species of those deciduous trees have wood that's much softer than a pine tree or any kind of coniferous tree, and coniferous trees tend to be generalized as called softwood. When you go into like a lumber store or something, that's why you have like softwoods, and they just kind of like throw it like it's fir, and they don't they don't make any distinction between whether it's grand fir, noble fir, Doug fir. I mean, Doug fir usually has a class of its own because that's not even technically a fir tree. But you see, have all these different classifications of firs that they just kind of lump together as like softwood lumber. So that's kind of like more of an industry-derived term. Evergreen doesn't necessarily mean a conifer or a deciduous tree. Evergreen is basically a tree that keeps its leaves on year-round. Hence, it's evergreen. And this can be, everything from like the angiosperm group, like the salal that I mentioned, like madrone, Pacific madrone. There's like all sorts of different trees that kind of fit into that category where they're a fruiting tree, angiosperm, that's how they reproduce with fruit and flowers and all that stuff. But then they have leaves that stay on year round. Most conifer trees are evergreens because they have needles that stay on year round. But then, like I mentioned in this video, there are little nuances with like a larch, for example, that drops its leaves because that's just kind of the adaptive strategy that it's evolved to take on. So again, I feel like I'm really not best at efficiently answering these questions, but I'm getting about it some roundabout way one time or another. Let me see what other question there has. Simon, I hope that answered your question. And if it didn't, feel free to ask another question for more details on that. What else we got? Chloe Van Loon. Hey, Chloe. Is snow common this time of year there, or potentially due to the climate crisis? We tend to get snow here usually like at least once a year, I'd say. Yeah, honestly, it's tough to say if it's really climate related. Like, I don't know. It's been a weird couple of years for sure. I mean, like this time last year, we were all rebuilding from that horrible rainstorm that happened this time of year, where it was like a lot warmer, a lot wetter than it's been this year, that took out all the roads and stuff going in and out of Vancouver. I think this time last year, Vancouver was still disconnected from from the rest of Canada. And then this year we've just had like weird cold snaps that comes in earlier. Yeah, I mean, I think the general trends out here are supposed to be getting warmer with more moisture coming in. And what I've kind of noticed is that winter seems to be kind of just shifting back and starting later in general. But like, yeah, we've had a weird start to it this year. Because certainly out here on the coast, we don't get a ton of snow that often. But it makes the surf pretty interesting because surfing in snow is just like a novel thing to do. Chloe has another question here. Know of any other plants that experience a similarly lengthy migration north like the Doug fir? Yeah, a lot of them, honestly. Doug firs are cool because like this world is always changing and moving around, right? Hemlocks have done the same thing, and they have like crossed the land bridge back in like days, just like a really long time ago with the ice sheets, and in between all this stuff, like when the ice sheet initially melted, the sea levels were much lower because where the ice had weighed down the continent, the continental plate actually dipped down. So basically created a land bridge. And so you have trees like the Douglas firs and things like migrated across the sea to like Japan, and hemlocks are the same thing too. And they've since split into different species of like hemlock tree. Western red cedars, the same thing has happened. It's a really interesting thing because here in the Northwest, we like think about cedar trees, especially from an indigenous perspective, being such a like so intertwined with indigenous life. But like those trees really didn't even exist here, I think, until about like 9,000 years is when they started becoming really prominent. And that's, you have to think like too, like that's when those first kind of cedars were able to come up here. And then it took, you know, 1,500 years for them to grow to these massive trees that then fell over. And then that's where you start getting the complexity that's developed in a lot of these old growth forests we have here throughout the province. And kind of Pacific Northwest down into Washington and Oregon, but less so these days because obviously we've logged a lot of that down in Washington. But yeah, the Doug fir is a cool one because we have, there's 3 different distinct species, or there's 4, I think. So we have like a coastal Douglas fir. So there's 3 species. We have a coastal Douglas fir, but within that there's 2 subspecies, one on the coast and then one in interior. And then what once was the Douglas fir has also divided into 3 different species. So the Doug fir one up north here, where I'm talking about, if you can visualize a map over my face here. And then you have the big cone Douglas fir down in California, and then one down in Mexico, the Mexican Douglas fir. And those, the ones in Mexico have just been kind of like isolated on like one kind of island of mountains. So they can't actually spread anywhere, and they're a threatened species down there because their habitat is being reduced by the similar things that are happening up here, plus climate change. A lot of desertification happening down there. I gotta move to these questions. There's a lot popping in here. Let me see. Oh, so how do I do this? So Sarah says, the change you want to see, what advice on how to inspire the world? Wow, heavy. What's your vision on how we collect awareness and consciousness of the climate crisis? I don't know. It's a weird thing that we're dealing with right now. I feel like there is this big paradigm shift that needs to happen, meaning that like a lot of us, not just individuals, but as a society, need to like fundamentally shift the way that we think about the way that we exist in our world, like especially in like a Western culture here in like the United States and Canada, and then of course from Europe, where all of our customs derived from. Like we've really only been operating like this for a couple hundred years, especially in this whole landscape, and we just, it's what we were born into, it's what we know, and so we just think of it as normal. But like when we stop and like look at the way that we're going throughout the world, like obviously like there's a huge disconnect between like the resources we're using, how fast we're using them, like the type of impact we're having on the lands around us, like the world that we live in. So I think it like fundamentally we need to like find a way to get people to just stop and reflect and think and look around. And I think that mostly comes down to having conversations with people. And this is where it gets difficult because obviously like there are a lot of like emotionally, stubbornly, arrogantly charged people from like different perspectives. And so I like to say that like when it comes to inspiring change and working with people, it's all just trying to create conversation in a constructive, healthy manner. And that involves not only speaking your true and authentic self, but also taking the time to like listen and empathize with the other person and like hear where they're coming from, and really taking that time to do that. And it's difficult because some people just want to talk, cuss, and not actually have a conversation. And for those people, like there's nothing you can do. I think it's like a lot of discernment of figuring out like who's ready and willing to have a conversation and who is just kind of like you know, just trying to use the internet to say nasty things that you'd never actually say to somebody's face, and, you know, keeping themselves from like having to have those difficult reckonings or conversations, and recognizing the things that need to change. And you see that that's rampant in every industry that makes money these days. But ultimately, like we need to find a way to shift that and figure out like, I don't know, different ways to make money that don't destroy the world we live in, I think. Yes, Ariane, hey, good to see you. Give us some examples of how climate change is affecting BC's biodiversity. Yeah, can I save this question for later on, because we kind of talk about this in the next couple chunks here. I'm gonna talk about mature forest ecosystems and how they kind of like stay the way that they are. And then we're going to talk about biodiversity and what it means kind of all towards the end. So I'm just going to pin that question there and come back to that one. Brett, oh, from Annalise. Okay. Any plants that are currently migrating that you think will have negative impact on the ecosystem? Honestly, it's too much. It's too complicated to really say what's going to be a negative impact. Like, change is always happening, change is always occurring. And so like these ecosystems are always in flux with different species and things moving throughout it. Like I'm going to talk about in the next couple ones, like the change that we're seeing is just happening so fast that like a lot of the species can't adapt. And so it's not necessarily about like, you know, species from the south moving up or migrating with like shifting climates that's an issue. I think the biggest issue is actually like invasives that come from different environments where they might have like different adaptations already that makes them more successful than all the different species we have out here. And with globalization and the way that mankind has just continually gotten around for hundreds of years, that's kind of like a big issue, because now we have a lot of different like, you know, things from Europe and Asia notably, especially here on the coast, like lots of different seaweeds and crabs and things within these different ecosystems that like can disrupt them on massive scales. And this is, again, like it affects biodiversity, because when you have like an ecosystem imbalance, it relies on a lot of different things happening within that ecosystem. And they're already experiencing change from the silly stuff we're doing as a species, and then climate change, which is putting stresses on them within those ecosystems. And then you have some rogue player coming in who's just like all of a sudden so much better at like eating or fighting or adapting, like whatever it is. It just makes it really difficult for the species that exist in that equilibrium to continue existing together. So it's just kind of throwing bows into the system here. And then what do we have here? What tree species in Canada? Okay, sorry, I should pop this one up on the screen. Another one from Marion. So what tree species in Canada are at risk of disappearing in the future if we don't take action? The big one is western red cedars out here on the coast of BC and kind of interior. These trees love a lot of moisture. They love rain. They love the cold, or not too cold, but like these cold kind of temperate environments. And if you look around every summer, especially towards the end of the summer, these really long, hot summers with a ton of drought are killing our cedars and making it really difficult for them to survive. And so one of the big things happening in like silviculture and forestry is they're doing this assisted migration thing where they're actually like starting to replant forests up here after logging with different species that are more adapted to a warmer climate, predicting that in like the next 60 years when they're going to be harvested again, 100 years, that the climate will be significantly different. So in many places, they're actually stopping to plant red cedars because they feel like they're not going to actually be able to survive in the climate that we'll have in 60 to 50 years. As saplings, like there's a chance that like maybe some of the bigger, older ones will be, you know, more mature, like next to a waterway, like those next to more like year-round streams and creeks are probably going to be all right. But all the ones that you kind of see on like the hillsides out surrounding Vancouver and through the mountains and everything, like it's likely that those trees aren't going to survive. So we're going to have a lot of die off in the next like few decades with that. And then with the assisted migration, you know, they're planting trees like sequoias and stuff. Redwoods from California that they're kind of expecting are going to be making their way up here anyway. So the idea of assisted migration is that they're helping those trees migrate so that the populations don't become threatened in the next like 100 years. This long-term thinking. But yeah, great question. Scary stuff. So any other questions here? This is really difficult, I've found, to keep up with all of this. But so with that being said, I'm going to have to catch up on these questions during this next little bit and maybe try to circle back on them. Feel free to keep asking questions, because when I play the next bit of the nature walk, I'm going to pin these and then hopefully be able to answer them in the next break here. And while I do this, why don't I just... 1 second, I just need to get this next segment of our video loaded here. We've got it. So anything, I guess, yeah, I guess we're going to carry on with the nature walk here. So feel free to continue asking questions and stuff, and I will get to it in the next little break. Here is the next installment.
Wow. I can't get over how beautiful of a paddy it is out here. Blowing my mind. So in that first little kind of tangent, we talked a lot about pioneer species and maturing, evolving ecosystems throughout drastic change, throughout different disturbances. And now we're going to have a look at these ecosystems at their mature state, their climax state, the kind of constant state of turnover that happens once they've kind of elevated to a point when everything is in relative equilibrium, although again, everything's always shifting and changing. So when an ecosystem is developing just after a disturbance or a clearing, you know, those deciduous trees that are able to synthesize nitrogen and provide that to the soil so that all their conifers and mosses and everything else can get the nitrogen it needs to create chlorophyll and grow, those are really important in those early stages. But once the forest kind of evolves to this climax or state dominated by conifers, it loses that ability for those, you know, those rapid turnovers that allow for alders to sprout up randomly and fix that soil. So there has to be another source of nitrogen within this forest. And this is where you get all sorts of different plants and things working together to kind of fill these different niches. And it's really cool stuff. So once trees, specifically certain cedars, get to a certain maturity, they start to develop these really cool branches, or what's known as a candelabra top. And there's a really cool one up here that I can kind of point to show you. If you can zoom in on that. So even I think if you step just a couple feet to your left here, you can see the top of that tree has died, and then those lower branches there have kind of reiterated to become these big shelf structures that allows for mosses and huckleberries and all sorts of other different species to live on that. So this is a really cool common thing that happens with cedars, and we can actually see a couple over here might be a little bit better talking points for this. So with western red cedars in these coastal environments, if you can imagine a forest canopy, and maybe come down to my hands here, I'll use my hands here as a little bit of an example. So this is the forest canopy. You have all these different trees that have come up and they've all kind of reached this maximum height that's dictated by the environment that they live in. Out here on the coast, there's a lot of strong coastal winds that kind of keep those trees at roughly the same height, because as soon as a tree starts to grow above that forest canopy, the leader of that tree is exposed to all those different elements that the forest itself kind of protects it from when it's deeper down in the forest. You know, this is a concept known as a boundary layer. So all the different friction points within this forest here slows down the wind and creates little microclimates of actually calmer air and wind areas within the understory and the canopy of the trees. But then as soon as that tree pokes above the canopy, that leader gets exposed to all that cold wind and air, and it ends up snapping the capillaries in the xylem and the phloem that allows the transfer of water and phloem up and down from the tree, and it ends up killing the leader of the tree, which we can see has happened in these western red cedars over here with these gray spire tips. So in all trees, at the leader of the tree, there's a certain hormone that tells that leader that it's going to grow up straight, and then every other branch that lacks that hormone is going to become a lateral branch growing out from the side. But when the tip of the tree dies, when the leader dies, all of a sudden there's no part of that tree that's producing that hormone. So the topmost, upper, most prominent branches of that tree are going to start to develop that hormone, telling it that it's the new leader, and those branches will slowly grow from being lateral branches to growing up straight, becoming new leaders of the tree. And this is a process of vegetative regeneration known as reiteration. And that's a really common thing with western red cedar. So that's why when you see a western red cedar with its tip broke off and then those lower branches all curving and shaping up towards the sky, that's actually that tree adapting to that change, adapting to the fact that its leader died, and the tree itself is still connected to at its roots. It's still able to photosynthesize through its lower branches. So it just reshapes that and ends up taking up more space within the forest canopy so that it can still continue to grow and thrive. And in doing that, it creates those shelves, those big shelves that allows for different mosses and ferns and epiphytes of all type to take root up there. One of the most important in an old growth forest like this is a species known as Lobaria. There's two different species. There's Lobaria oregana and there's Lobaria, Lobaria oregana and Lobaria pulmonaria. They're these two different species of lichen that live all the way up there, up way up high in that forest canopy, and they too, just like those alders, are able to synthesize atmospheric nitrogen from the air and use it to create chlorophyll within themselves that they use to photosynthesize. And then when that lichen dies, it flakes off and finds its way to filter down to the forest floor. And when it breaks down, it reinvigorates the forest floor, the soil and the humus there with that nitrogen that allows for these cedars to continue to grow and thrive and grow big and create habitat for more lichen. It's all part of this interconnected cycle where the lichen required the tree to be big and old for it to grow in its spot, and then when it dies, it helps that tree continue to maintain its strength and grow big and old, and the whole forest ecosystem kind of evolves on that. So another really cool, really important part of this mature forest evolution is if you have a look around at the understory here, there's not a lot of free space. So if you're like a little tiny seedling, a little cone of a hemlock or some kind, let me see if I can find a hemlock cone actually, that'd be pretty cool. Yeah, so if you are this little tiny hemlock cone, and this one's kind of a little bit degraded, it's pretty old. You can see its wings are open there, so it's releasing seeds. So if you're a little tiny hemlock cone like this, and you fall to the forest floor, and you land somewhere in that understory, like what are the odds you think you're gonna be getting any sort of light and growing? It's so thick, it's so dense, there's so many different species of salal and huckleberry and all these different trees kind of living and growing there. It's gonna be really difficult for you to establish yourselves. But if you have some sort of platform, some sort of thing that's elevated above the forest floor, that gives you another opportunity to grow and thrive. So in this case here, we've got a nurse log or a fallen tree of some kind, and you can see it's this big hump here. So imagine when this tree first came down, it crashed through the understory and it created this platform here that allowed for, that cedar right back here to grow, as well as these different huckleberries that are now growing on top of that. So it gave those seed cones an opportunity to get above the forest floor, to get light and nutrients and resources that it needs to grow and thrive, to create a whole new tree. And eventually, as this cedar grows on top of this old nurse log, its roots are gonna wrap around it, go into the soil, where it's gonna stabilize itself and get more nutrients as this original fallen nurse log starts to erode and decay and eventually leave this kind of standing gap here. And if we pivot right around here, there's actually a really cool example of this, where you can see, oh, this is wild. So we have this big red cedar here, is kind of swooping up this way, but its roots have gone around an old fallen tree that once existed here. You can kind of see the remnants of that root wad. So this big this cedar here was originally growing on that nurse log of a fallen tree. And then from that, you have this western hemlock that is grown on top of that. So this hemlock is growing on top of this cedar, which was growing on top of a dead cedar or dead tree of some kind that fell over here. And we can watch all these individual roots come down, forming this kind of really cool archway thing. It's just absolutely gorgeous to see the way that all this life kind of like finds a way to kind of keep on keeping on. And then if we go over here, there's a really cool example of this same thing happening, but on a much bigger, much older living western red cedar tree. Follow me, this is beautiful. So there's these two red cedars here. And in this big one, you can see how this lower branch here has reiterated when the leader of that tree died and become this new reiterated second leader there, creating that big shelf where you can see a couple ferns and stuff, and there's a western hemlock growing there. So you can see that western hemlock growing right along the trunk of the old part of the cedar that's now died. And then you can see, you can follow that root going all the way down into the soil, and then it plugs into the soil and the mycorrhizal fungi network down there that allows that tree to grow and thrive, which is friggin' incredible. So you have this massive, that tree, that cedar, usually it takes about, western red cedars about 300 years to reach the size and age when they start to even have dead leaders and form those kind of reiterated branches. And with the thickness of that one, this tree is probably about 400 to 500 years old, I'd say. And then on top of that, you have this western hemlock that's growing in the branches up there, using that platform that the cedar has created on that shelf above the forest floor to continue to grow, sending its root leaders or root shoots kind of down into the soil so that it can stabilize and get more nutrients that it needs to grow and survive. It's just life on life on life growing on top of it. And on top of all that, then again, you have those lichens, those mosses, the ferns, the different epiphytes that are providing different resources by storing water, creating microclimates that aid in that boundary layer concept that reduces the amount of wind that comes through here, that actually keeps things warmer in the wintertime under the forest canopy and cooler in the summertime. It's just this whole mesh where not only are all these different life forms kind of finding their own way to grow and thrive within these different ecosystems, but they create the ecosystem themselves. And yeah, I'm talking about old growth coastal western hemlock forest here, but this same concept applies to wetlands, to deserts, to forests all throughout BC, to marine environments, to coastal environments. This whole concept is just like the same, just life compounds on top of life, and it creates this complexity that performs all this different ecological function and makes these places just so dang gorgeous. Check it out. Wow. So beautiful. Now, one of the trees I haven't mentioned so far is a Sitka spruce, and I just feel that I need to tell you all about this tree because it is so gorgeous, and this is a beautiful specimen we've got right here, this massive Sitka spruce that has that similar root structure where you can look at it and see that it at one point started its life on some sort of fallen lump of tree or branch or something that created this really wide sprawling base, kind of like a tripod. You can see it's just like, and look at how thick this root is. I mean, that is like over a meter thick, just that one root, and it provides the wide base to this big Sitka spruce that grows way up there. And then within this spruce, you can see even right along here, there's all sorts of cladonia and different lichens kind of on the lower part of this tree. And if you get close to the tree and look up, and maybe like if you zoom up to get that, you can just see that as you move up this tree, those branches become thicker, bigger, and the amount of lichen and mosses on them just kind of like compounds exponentially on it. Pretty dang incredible. Now, Sitka spruces have a similar process to western red cedars where they reiterate, but instead of on a western red cedar, the branches, the lateral branches that become new leaders will actually like curve and bend up. Whereas on a Sitka spruce like this one here, those lateral branches go out. When the leader dies, instead of like that branch curving, it'll sprout a new branch, or yeah, a new like leaf bud will turn into a new leader. So it'll grow straight up from that tree. So it's kind of difficult to see here, but you can see this lower branch on the left-hand side. It goes out, and then it has like what looks like a whole new tree growing straight out from that branch. Pretty dang incredible. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not talking about bryophytes or different mosses. I'm not talking about, you know, how cool these deer ferns are or any of this other stuff. I'm simply trying to give you kind of the macro picture of what's happening in this forest ecosystem at its mature state. So you can get the idea of just how complex and nuanced all this stuff is. Take a look at this cedar. This thing's nuts. You can see that it was growing on this fallen log here. So it's got branches reiterating down there, and then it's kind of grown into that. It's just, there's too much to get into here, but basically what I want to leave you all with is this idea that like, yeah, change is constant and always happening, and on micro scales, it's happening in these ecosystems all around us at all times. And it's fascinating to see all this life kind of growing on life and everything having its own different role within this ecosystem. So again, I'm going to spit it back to myself at my computer and answer any questions you've got on that stuff. Check it out.
Wow, wasn't that fun? I'm going to go ahead and bring Natalie Knowles back into the chat here so that she can try to address some questions as well, provided that her internet is all right. So, yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to write it in the chat, whether you're on Facebook or YouTube. It'll show up on our end here, and then we'll start to chat about it. Nat, would you like to start with this question here from Wiley?
Yeah, absolutely. I think native plant incredible solution to biodiversity loss and climate change. One piece of advice I have for people looking to be to think about what the climate's going to be like in the future. So if you're seeing if your area is going to be more dry and hot in the summer, you're going to want to make sure you're planting species that are resilient to that. As Ross kind of said, there's species that are moving and system zones that they were in before may or may not area. So species that might have been native plants in one area previously may not be native ranges as climate change comes on. So we want to be planting for resilient species.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's awesome. Just to add to that, like, yeah, native plant gardens are incredible and awesome, and I 110% support that. Yeah, and just to reiterate, in case that was choppy for Nat, how was that for people? You want to chat in, let us know. But yeah, like, things are always changing. So if you're going to be planting native plant species, be sure to plant the ones that are like going to be resilient to the changes predicted in your area. Because like some areas are going to be experiencing a lot of wetness, like a lot more rain, and a lot of areas are going to be getting drier. Everything's generally going to be getting warmer, but there's just a lot of nuances to the models and stuff that they're predicting for how things are going to change. So just make sure it's kind of in line with that. Thanks, Wiley. What else do we have here? Seeger, I'm going to take a moment to say what up to Seeger. We talk about some of the fish restoration work you've been doing. Any big wins? Yeah, so I work for a restoration company out here on the coast of Vancouver Island called Redfish Restoration. We do habitat restoration in watersheds damaged by logging in the 70s, 80s, 90s, because there's a lot of really bad things that happened in those watersheds. And so big wins, yeah, we've been working mostly on there's this big large in-stream wood structure that we installed in the spring, or no, in the fall. It's been really recent. I think we did it in September, right before the fish started running. So yeah, we have this massive structure that's like we flew like some big old growth trees that were donated or that we had to purchase from like local, like things that either came down naturally in the area or like logging companies. Like we had to buy old growth trees, logs, and then fly them back into this watershed because all the old growth trees had been removed when things were logged. And trees on the riverbanks are a really important part of stabilizing the riverbanks. It keeps the river from meandering too far too quick. It keeps banks stabilized, keeps soils from eroding, and it also provides a lot of habitat for fish. So we flew these big logs back in, have this like structure that this engineering company out of Oregon kind of designed for us, and we have it all built up, and it's just kind of now going through its first winter where it's going to be like settling and kind of experiencing those like higher flows and things that are going to like ultimately like kind of shift it, but it'll like kind of nestle into itself to be this big woody structure within the river that ultimately is going to create a lot of habitat for fish. Notably salmon is kind of like the primary goal here. But it's really cool because, as we like, one of the first things we did was like use an excavator and dig into the channel before any fish were present. There was nothing migrating up at the time. This is in like August, I believe. And then we laid these logs in, and like literally the next week there were all sorts of little juvenile fish and trout hanging out there. And then as the fish have started running, we've noticed that like when I was last out there was a big group of chum salmon that were kind of spawning in the shallow side, like on the opposite side of the bank to where the wood structure is, spawning there. But then a bear came by, and when the bear was kind of trying to fish for him, all the fish would dart under the structure and hide out there, which is just like really awesome to see. So it's like these ecosystems are totally capable of rebounding and like coming back and flourishing with all this diversity. It's just like we need to like do more than just like, I don't know, protect it in a way. Like the kind of common Western idea of conservation is that you just like, you put a park boundary around it and you stay out and you don't touch it. But like humans are animals. We've always been active parts of these ecosystems. And I think like one of the things that we really need to come to terms with, again, going back to that shifting paradigm thing, is that, we can't just like leave things alone and expect it to be all right. Like we need to maintain a role of like active participation in these ecosystems. And a lot of that is going to involve like restoration work that helps build the resilience and the biodiversity in these ecosystems so that they can become adaptable and resilient to the changes that are coming. And we need to just stop creating those changes. So we need to like obviously stop doing anything to like create climate change, but then also all of the like habitat fragmentation, destruction, like all the stuff we're doing, uncontrolled, rampant industrial logging with clear cuts and like not ecologically sound practices that are still being used all throughout Canada. We just need to stop. We got to do things differently. Got to do it better. Thanks for asking a question there, Seeger. What else do we got here? Let me see how many folks we have. So how do you have this wealth of knowledge from Mark? Formal education or just a level of interest where you took the time to learn on your own? Yeah, I'd say it's somewhere in between. Yeah, definitely somewhere in between. I went to school for biology, like in my undergrad, but I never pursued it because I hate math. I was like, I feel like I had a really traumatizing learning experience with math as a kid. So then as soon as it came time to get into physics or anything, I was just like, nah, like start doing physics and chemistry, like calculating like ions and stuff. Like it was just like, I was numbers and I was just like, I was triggered. I just didn't do it. So I never pursued anything like that, but I'm like super interested obviously in all the ecological processes and everything. So a lot of it then has just been like reading and studying on my own free time just because I'm into it and I think it's rad. So yeah. School's great, but like you can also, there's other ways to get there, you know? Nico, have I ever considered writing a nerdy about nature book? Yeah, I have. I'm busy though, man. I got so much going on. I'm like, I have a couple really fun, really creative projects that are like basically just exist in little notepads and things. But I would love to write a book of some kind at some point. I just need to find a way to get the stability doing this nerdy about nature thing, and the time. I need time and energy. Stay tuned. What else do we have? Any other questions? Any other questions from anybody? Nat, any comments, questions, anything you'd like to clarify that I've not touched on?
No, I just think there is a lot of overlap, lots of stuff that we can learn from want to tackle climate change, from adaptation to diversity, collaboration, working together. You know, there's you can learn from nature. It's really, really cool.
Yeah. Nature is collaborative, not competitive, as we've kind of been taught to believe.
Yeah.
It's funny. It's kind of like, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to rant about the correlations between like that kind of Darwinian theory that like I feel like I learned in school in like the 90s and 2000s, just where everything is like competitive and survival of the fittest. Like that kind of inherently is like also like a very kind of like stubborn kind of capitalist mindset, where when we learn more about this stuff, we learn all about it, we realize that like everything is actually like working together with everything else, and there's like a push and pull within all these different things. And I wish in this chat I could have had time to chat about mycorrhizal fungi and stuff, because that's like a really cool great,
absolutely,
yeah, it's like a really awesome subject that really encompasses like what life is really all about, and it is this like reciprocal working together with all these different species. Okay, so if nobody has any other questions for now, then we're going to pop into the last final segment here, and then we can kind of have more chats about stuff, and I'll circle back to some questions that popped up as well. So without further ado, here's the third chunk of the nature walk.
So this whole ecosystem every ecosystem is just this intricate web and mesh of life. And not only do they kind of exist on their own in this way and find ways to, recycle nitrogen and different elements within themselves, but they rely on the health of other ecosystems. So for example, one of the most coolest things that I haven't even mentioned is these coastal ecosystems are really any forest ecosystem that has a salmon-bearing stream that goes through it. This goes, deep up the Columbia, in through Kamloops and Kelowna, like all through interior BC to up northern BC. Even on the East Coast, there are salmon-bearing streams. And those oceanic conditions that affect the lives of those salmon find their ways to impact these forests, and vice versa, because I'll start with the forest. So the salmon spawn in those channels, and the health of the eggs that they're able to lay in the redds that they make in those streams all depends on the health of the surrounding forest, because that surrounding forest, creates shade and cover for that stream. It mitigates the amount of water and runoff into it. It mitigates the amount of erosion. And when things are silted up or there's a lot of erosion, all that gravel gets covered in fine sediments that the salmon can no longer dig their redds into. They can't lay their eggs. So the health of the salmon species starts in the forest, in a healthy forest ecosystem. Those salmon fry then hatch, and they spend their first couple of years in the streams, making their way out to the ocean, where the health of the oceans impacts how big they're able to get, how strong they're able to get, how much nutrients and resources they're able to get for their ride or for their journey back home up that same creek. And when they die on that spawning journey, or after they've spawned up that same creek they're born into, their bodies are carried off into these forests by bears, wolves, birds, all sorts of different critters that redistribute those nutrients. And then, they're broken down, either the carcasses are broken down by fungi or slugs or insects, or the nutrients find their way to the forest floor in the form of scat of whatever's eating them. Somehow, all those nutrients end up getting recycled back into the forest ecosystem. So out in the ocean, there's a lot of stable isotopes of carbon 13 and nitrogen 15. Rare stable isotopes of those elements, and they only exist in ocean ecosystems, yet those salmon bring them back here and provide a huge boost to these forest ecosystems in those nutrients. So in some of these older, more mature cedars, they've been able to do studies where 50% of the nitrogen in that wood that's used to create the chlorophyll initially that allows them to photosynthesize comes directly from these salmon, bringing those nutrients up from the oceans. So not only are these individual ecosystems one interconnected web or mesh of life, but the world that we all share is these interconnected webs and meshes of different ecosystems functioning with one another, which is pretty incredible if you think about it. So when we look at what's happening today in the world around us, there's all sorts of different things that we as a human species are kind of battling. A lot of it is related directly to human actions right now. That's, development, habitat destruction, fragmentation, all sorts of different things that disconnects all the way that all these different species interact with one another on a large scale across Canada and global scale. But within that, there are those kind of more anthropogenic things that are happening on longer scales that are beyond our immediate comprehension. And this is where you get into these wiggly terms like climate change, where it's something that we're able to document and see, but we don't really know what it's going to do or how it's going to impact things or any of the changes that are to come. All that we know is that we are currently in this state and we are experiencing climate change. So what does this mean for these ecosystems, and why is biodiversity important? Because like I talked about at the beginning, forests change. Douglas fir trees migrated up from Mexico over thousands of years, moving one seed at a time up the continent to come where they are today. And now they're like so well established, we couldn't imagine the Pacific Northwest without Douglas fir trees or without big western red cedars. The same thing happened with them. But that change happened over a very long period of time when conditions were still relatively stable from a climate perspective and environment perspective that allowed them to migrate slowly up the continent. What we're seeing today, and the issue why this is so important to maintain biodiversity, is because a lot of the changes that we're seeing, whether it be climate change related or more direct impacts from humans like development and logging and all the habitat destruction, is that those changes are happening so rapidly. These ecosystems, these species can't adapt to these changes. So you get things where, that lichen that I talked about earlier, with habitat fragmentation, yeah, it exists highly or most densely in old growth forest ecosystems, which rely on that lichen to give it the nitrogen it needs. But if that old growth forest is reduced to a sliver along a stream, and then it's logged second growth for as far as the eye can see around that, that doesn't give that species much opportunity to grow and expand beyond that. And as those secondary forests mature, who knows what kind of changes we're going to see with climate change that could affect that old growth forest and lead to it falling apart and it decaying at a rate that we haven't been able to predict, so that it reduces the amount of habitat available for that specific lichen species. And if it goes extinct, what's it going to say for the future of forests that all depend on that lichen in its climax state to give it the nutrients that it needs for that forest to continue to regenerate? So there's all these impacts that are happening all around the world with things changing too fast for these different ecosystems, different species to adapt to. And that is why it's so crucial and important that we kind of maintain all this biodiversity, because this biodiversity in a way is like a safety net. And if we can have a more diverse range of different species that are able to fulfill different niches and different roles within an ecosystem as things change, different things that are able to adapt to changes more better than other ones, or create a different opportunity for other things to grow and thrive, then the more resilient these ecosystems are going to be, no matter what changes occur over the next 100, 1,000, 2,000 years, whether or not our societies or we as individuals are going to be there or not. We have to consider the impact that our legacy is going to have on these ecosystems and life functioning as a whole on this planet that we all share. So in conclusion, while all these ecosystems have been changing since the beginning of time, the changes that we're seeing happening today, whether it be small scale changes from forests like this being logged, to wetlands that are being drained and paved over, to grasslands that are being continually mowed and plowed for centuries now, these changes all impact the way that these ecosystems adapt and grow and continue to rebound and create resiliency within themselves. And the dynamic between all these different species is what allows all these different ecosystems to thrive and perform all the ecological functions that we need. So ultimately, we need to find a way to preserve as much biodiversity as we possibly can, not only for our future lives on this planet, but the future of life as we know it on this planet, so that everything here can continue to grow as big, cool, and amazing and neat as all these different trees around me. One more thing for conclusion here, check out this western hemlock in this western red cedar. That thing has got to be, what, 40, 50 meters in the air? That hemlock germinated up there on that branch of the cedar, and its root, you can follow its root all the way down that cedar to where it goes into the soil there. That hemlock tree that's maybe only 20, 30 feet tall, living way up there in the canopy of that red cedar. That's complexity, that's biodiversity, that's life thriving out here. Pretty dang neat. Thanks for coming, and I'll catch you all back in the Q&A section here if you have any other questions and conclusions here. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks for joining me on that lovely little nature walk. You're probably all much warmer and cozier at home than was out in the field that day. Pretty chilly. So we've got a couple more questions here that I'm just going to address. So what do we got? So Chloe, again, coming in with a heater question. Okay, so are you aware of movements to protect specific areas as part of the 30% goal? These announcements always seem to fall short. Yes, they most certainly do, don't they? Funny how that works with government. Yeah, I think someone from the POW team has responded as well. So currently, I think the Canadian government protects about, it's like 12.5% and 13% of land and water is protected. But then within this, there's like so many different nuances, you know, like I did a video just like earlier this week or last week about like the kind of the ways that the park system, for example, this like way that we are using parks to protect biodiversity is actually failing to protect biodiversity, because parks tend to be established in the most like scenic, breathtaking looking places, which tends to be a lot of like mountainous areas, high mountainous areas where that lacks like all the biodiversity. So one of the biggest issues that I see with like the way that the current government is going about trying to protect and maintain this biodiversity is that they're just using it as like a broad number of landscape, but they're not actually preserving like 30% of the species, or sorry, like they're using it as a way to justify like protecting 30% of the land, but not necessarily 30% of all the different species. So like this is like blown out of proportion to like to expand on this, but it's like under the current model, like 70% of the species in BC could theoretically go extinct, and they would only be protecting 30%, because the way that they're doing it isn't relative to like the biodiversity of the different biogeoclimatic zones that we have within the province. So we need to shift the way that we're going about this protection to actually like protect things equally, and like the areas that have the highest amount of biodiversity need to be protected at higher scales versus areas that lack that biodiversity, which are currently protected more than anything else in the province right now. Well, in the province, and that of course the same thing kind of works all throughout Canada. As they mentioned too, the way that our country works, it actually kind of makes it difficult to do that, because there's like autonomy between the different provinces, yet the federal government is kind of like overseeing everything. So it takes a lot of cooperation to make those things come together. And it's really difficult because, you know, provinces change and political parties come in and out of power. And there's just like a lot of like different objectives that different parties and populations have for the lands in use. I think a really important issue to continue to address within that whole discussion is, of course, like recognizing the fact that like these lands aren't really the government's, like they don't really have the say to like protect them. Like they're stolen Indigenous lands, and we need to get Indigenous people like involved in these conversations more than anybody else, and let them take the reins with it. And part of that is going to require giving them like building an economic model per se that allows Indigenous people to have freedom of mobility and economic gains without having to like sacrifice the natural resources in their area, which is kind of how it's always been pitted. They end up making these decisions out of states of duress because the only income that option they have is to log their lands, for example. And we need to create a system that allows them to have different economic sources or different ways to prosper without having to destroy the lands for the kind of consumption machine of Western society. So that's like a big thing with trying to find ways to protect that biodiversity, to protect those lands, is like working, again, like I mentioned in the last kind of Q&A thing, working with the lands and being like an active part of these ecosystems to maintain that biodiversity, and changing the way that we think about our levels of engagement with that so that we can work to create a better world for all of us. Humans, animals, all sorts of people. The world's full of all sorts of different people. Yeah, that's a great question. I could rant about that for ages, but I'm gonna just make that one disappear right now. What other questions we got here? Mackenzie Vandal, I probably pronounced that horribly wrong. What are your thoughts on dams, specifically Site C Dam being built in Hudson's Hope, BC? I've been there this past summer, and the destruction of homes and deforestation to build the dam is heartbreaking. Yeah, sure is. Yeah, I don't think dams are kind of the way forward. I honestly think that's kind of like an old kind of colonial relic that we're still trying to keep around for the sake of jobs and energy. But if you look at the way dams operate, they're only actually like operating at like a net benefit for like a couple short decades, which is like not a lot of time given the amount of resources that it takes to build them in the first place and the amount of destruction that they cause, especially in areas like BC, because we are like a very recently in the global history of the world, very recently glaciated area, and there is like a ton of meltwater, there's a ton of sediment, there's a ton of things coming down into these rivers every year, and it's like filling up these dams and making them ineffective. That when also combined with climate change, like when you look at dams in the States where the reservoirs are going dry and all of a sudden like they're not able to get the power they were initially designed for, like I think it's an unpredictable and wasteful way to spend money. Site C especially is horrible because that's like burying indigenous burial grounds and all sorts of different communities with water, in addition to threatening hundreds of species. I can't remember the exact number. It's over 100 species that are threatened or endangered or at risk. So at the same time, Canada is claiming to be protecting biodiversity. They're actively engaged in resource extraction power projects like this that threaten those very same species. So it's like, it's kind of like that whole thing where it's like climate leaders don't build pipelines. Like we need to recognize like what the government is saying and what they're doing is like two totally different things, and we need to continue to have these public conversations and shift the things that we're actually doing so that they're in line with what we're saying, and be accountable to what, like, the future we want to create, the future that the leaders keep selling us and greenwashing us and telling us that they're making for us. We need to actually like take initiative to make those things happen. Yeah, Site C is brutal one. What else we got here? Evan Litauer. Hey Ross, what enables a tree branch to grow straight up as a leader? How do you mean there, Evan? I think I answered that in the first kind of one. So a tree, start at the beginning. So when a tree is still a seed, when it's starting to sprout, it has within the seed, it has a statolith or statocyst, which is a tiny little organelle that has a really heavy chunk of calcium in it that drifts down. So that tells the organelle, which then tells the seed which direction down is. So it knows which way to start growing. So it starts growing up, breaking through the surface, and then that organelle continues. They're still in the trees. They have like different statoliths that tell them which direction up is, especially shade tolerant trees that don't necessarily have the opportunity to grow towards the light as we tend to think like plants do, or as they do, not we. No tend to thinking there. They do grow towards the light. You have a house plant that will like go towards the window to find that, drawn to the source of light, but also because the statoliths kind of tell them which direction is up. So that's how they kind of continue to keep growing. Now within the leader of a tree, there's a certain hormone. I don't know the name of that hormone, the technical term for it, but there's a hormone in the leader that tells all the new leaf buds that sprout on there to continue growing up because it's the leader of the tree. Whereas anywhere else in the tree, they lack that hormone. So when a leaf bud sprouts, it grows out as a lateral branch. And then that's how it goes. So the leader goes up, and then the branches can keep coming off from the side as lateral branches. And then, as I mentioned with the cedars, when the tip of the leader dies or falls off for whatever reason, breaks, or around the coast or just anywhere really, you get all sorts of different types of funky reiteration where like maybe a tree will like if it's growing in loose soil and then it starts to slant as it grows, you'll actually see it'll like slowly bend and redirect to grow up. That's that same thing. That's that hormone balancing out those statoliths. So it falls like this. The statolith's like, oh, wait, we're now a little bit sideways. Gravity is now over here. So then as it grows, it'll start to, the leader will direct up until it's growing straight up again, which is kind of cool if you see those like bent trees. But also, when like a tree will fall over all the way and its roots will still be embedded in the soil. And I have a video coming out in a couple weeks or days, I don't know when I'm going to release it, about this as well. Some of those lower branches that were formerly lateral branches on the tree, so if this is the tree, it falls over, they're now lateral branches, they will start to generate that hormone that tells them to become new leaders. Same thing happens, as I mentioned earlier, with Western red cedars. When the leader dies, those upper most prominent lateral branches will start to develop that hormone, and they will reiterate to become leaders, and that's what creates those really cool candelabra like forked crowns and canopies that are really emblematic of Western red cedars around here. Really freaking cool trees. Really cool thing that that trees do to just keep on growing and being so dang neat. Thanks for asking a question. What do we got here? Site C answered that one. Opinions on nuclear energy. I think the concept and idea of nuclear energy is awesome. I think politically, socially, we're a little bit too immature to have that as an option because, like, human societies, we just don't have it together. Like, I mean, even in Ukraine right now, where there's like war going on and there's like a lot of nuclear energy plants, like it's a big liability to have in an unstable area. And I don't trust our species enough politically and socially to have that kind of responsibility. But it's great if we could live in a world where nuclear energy could be like there, like I think it'd be awesome. But yeah, I don't know. That's a touchy one. What else do we have? Any other questions here? Let me see. Nico, what's the most endangered lichen species in BC? It's tough to say what the most endangered one is. I know there are many endangered ones. There was a report that recently came out on the speckle belly lichen, which exists like in coastal forests. More notably, they found a bunch in Fairy Creek, which is kind of still actively being logged. So yeah, like there are a lot that are at risk, and like it's interesting. Like the species of Lobaria that I mentioned too, like those species do exist in second growth forests. Like I have like some kind of more conservative logger folk who will like message me on Instagram and be like, oh, what you're saying about the lichens bullshit, or bullcuss, sorry, I can't swear here. Bullcuss, because, you know, I go up into these branches and there's this lichen all over the place. And like, yeah, you're not wrong. They still exist in second growth forests, but they exist in highest abundance. Like if you look at like a population density graph of these lichen, as soon as a forest hits like over 300, 400 years old, like they boom, because the niche or the habitat that they kind of require to grow only exists way up at the tops of these canopies, where there's it's like a whole different climate than it is down the forest floor. When you're walking through a forest, it feels nice and humid and cool, but then you get up there, it's much more drier. The wind whips through easier. It can be hotter. It can be like much colder and drier in the winter times. Generally, again, there's nuances to all of this depending on where you are, but ultimately, like a lot of that habitat that they have, that they rely on, doesn't start to form and shape until trees get to be about 300 years old, start to develop those characteristics that makes it specific habitat for that. Same goes with habitat on the ground. You know, there's also a lot of talk right now about protecting bear dens in BC for bears, because bears and another tangent, sorry. So bears specifically will like will habituate and use those like big dens of those like cedars that I talked about in the second video there. We have like the big flying buttress style where it grew on top of a nurse log. Like that's a feature that only exists in old growth forests. Like you need a massive log to have fallen on the ground for another tree to germinate on it and grow around it. So when that log, you know, degrades, it leaves that kind of flying buttress root structure there, because that creates habitat for all sorts of creatures. If we cut it all down like we've been doing and then replant, like all the replanted trees, like they're not growing on big fallen logs and stumps, like they're not going to have that structure. So it's like something that, like, even if that forest gets to be the government standard definition of an old growth forest at 250 years, it's still going to lack that habitat. So it's like we need to start like now, like on the ground, and like, you know, like we need to look at the ecosystems and the way it's existed for the past thousands of years in order to plan ahead for like the habitat that we're creating. So it's more than just like, we're planting 2 billion trees in the next 10 years. Good job, Canada. It's like, yeah, that's great. Planting trees is awesome. But we really need to stop like the habitat destruction and fragmentation, because that's what's ultimately like reducing all the habitat for species like lichen and the big charismatic species like bears. Thanks for asking that question. That's a good one. Chloe coming in again. What do we have here? Are you hopeful of what will come from COP15 or same old blah, blah, blah? Yeah, I'm optimistic. I think a lot of it's going to be the same old blah, blah, blah. But generally, when we see these big kind of UN things, like there are good things that come from it. Often our kind of Instagram feeds skim over it because there tends to be a lot more promise that falls through than the stuff that actually does happen. So I think like we are going to see a couple of things start to happen here. I just actually read a report before I logged on here, or saw a thing. I didn't read a report about it, but I saw a post that within the EU, any wood products sold within the EU have to be verified that they're not leading to forest degradation, which is really awesome, because in previous years, the whole thing has been like deforestation. We don't want to contribute to deforestation. Now that the conversation has shifted to forest degradation, that puts emphasis on keeping primary forest standing, which is a huge thing. Like throughout Canada, Canada loves to boast that it's like one of the lowest rates of deforestation in the world, because yeah, we log a lot, but we replant. So technically that's not losing forest, because we just wipe the old forest away and then like plant new trees. So that's like not deforestation. But when you look at the quality of these ecosystems and the complexity of these habitats, they're radically changing. So we get a much more simplified ecosystem. Even though we're not losing forest cover, we're degrading the ecosystem. So the fact that the EU has now put in a law into place that says that you can't like sell anything that's contributing to forest degradation, that is going to force a lot of logging within the EU specifically to have to like really revisit the way that they're operating. And like all of a sudden, you know, plantation crop forests are going to have to be managed differently. And I think as that law gets established there, like maybe that'll influence some law in Canada. We really ideally need it over in like places like Asia, Japan, because Japan's like our biggest, we like Canada exports the most wood products to Japan and China. So if there was like a law over there that said that those forest products couldn't contribute to forest degradation, that would be hugely impactful for Canada, because we would all of a sudden have to like revise the way we're doing everything, because right now our practices are horribly degrading. So yeah, I think good things will come from it. Probably a lot of bad things, but that's just the way it goes. So many questions here. If dam building for Bryn, if dam building for hydroelectric power generation isn't consistent in damaging biodiversity, what are options for power that do not have significant impact on surrounding ecosystems? Solar, I find solar to be like a really good one, because there are a lot of ways that we can implement solar power on like kind of a what's the term? Kind of like a vertical farming type thing, where it's like in areas that get a lot of sun, we can almost kind of change the microclimate in a way by adding solar panels that are elevated that create shady understory where we can grow shade tolerant crops of food. So it's like we can create these kind of like small scale local things where we can like utilize the fact that we're getting solar power to create like a whole new economy under the solar power, instead of just like having just like fields blanketed with solar dishes where that's the only thing we're doing. We can like find ways to integrate it all so it's all kind of like one cohesive mesh. So it's like, yeah, we're capturing energy from the sun, and then we're shading vegetation underneath, even if it's like a wild grass field, and that gives a place for birds and bees and flowers, things like we're going to be you know, taking carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it into like some healthy soil. So there's like many ways we can work on that. Natalie Knowles is typing to me in our group chat box here because her internet's a little bit glitchy, but she's also saying micro hydro, which is another really great thing. A lot of micro hydro projects don't involve like the big dams, but you can do really cool run of river power projects that don't disrupt the flow of a river and kind of operate more seasonally, as like depending on the regime of the flow, whether it's like more nival or snowmelt dictated system or rain system, but it works within the river system to generate like power for like small kind of communities. Like that would be amazing. And then overall, it's just like using less energy is a really great thing to stick to. That's kind of like probably the biggest one. Like ultimately, like we're kind of over the carrying capacity on our planet as far as like our energy consumption goes. So it's like, this is like a tangent. Like I hear a lot of like cynics will say, overpopulation is the biggest thing, and like our planet's overpopulated and we need to stop having kids because that's what's killing our planet. And it's like, no, that's not the case. Like that's just like, if anything, like that's like a very arrogant way of looking at it, because it's like if we're all living like we are here in North America, then yeah, like nobody can do that because there's not enough resources on the planet. So it's not about not having kids, it's not about this world being overpopulated by any means. If anything, there's too much of a minority of people using far more resources than the world is capable of supplying. So really what that comes down to is we all need to just like use less, or use products that like use less energy. LED light bulbs, like the ones I have in here, like things that are more energy and like energy sensitive and conservative, I think is a great way to operate there. Thanks, Bryn. And thanks, Jody, for tuning in. It's so great to see you guys. Any other questions we got here? Wiley said, what do I think about the Alberta Sovereignty Act? I honestly don't know anything about that. I haven't heard of that, so I can't answer that. Oh, man, this is a... I'm at like an hour and a half here, so I probably can't stay on for like all night just answering questions, as fun as this is. This is a good question. I'll pop up here. What's the situation with fish farms in BC? Sorry. Okay. I just got a message. Okay. So fish farms in BC, thought they're on their way out. Now it seems complicated. Certainly very complicated. Yeah, this is like the federal thing, like with conserving biodiversity. There's just like a lot of overlapping government things happening here, especially like there are like indigenous nations that are choosing to use fish farms, and that's they have every right to do that. And then there are others that are like very anti it. And then overall, you have like in BC, there's not like strict legislation saying that they can't have it. Although it seems to be going that way because all the science shows how horrible fish farms, especially aquatic fish farms, are. Like if these fish farms operated on land and these companies from Norway wanted to build their own things on land, that would actually be fine. It'd be great because you can contain the population, you could use the antibiotics, and you can do all the terrible things you're doing to them. The issue is the fact that it exists in an open net pen in the water that affects the ecosystem that it lives in, and that's where like you get all these detriments. The only thing is that's really cheap for them to do, so of course they're going to do that. It's the easiest thing, easiest option for them. But yeah, long story short, it is very complicated. I don't know what the future of that entails. I'm optimistic, but we'll see. So that is just about it. I think we have time for one more question I got a message for, but it doesn't seem that there are any more questions. So yeah, I think I'm going to wrap that up unless I see one more pop in here really quick. But thanks to everybody for tuning into this. Been really fun doing this first live. I'm going to see what the feedback is, and maybe we can do more stuff like this. If you guys can all check out this link here, protectourwinters.ca/flora fauna future. This is kind of a new campaign that Protect Our Winters is working on that has more information about how we can all work together to protect biodiversity throughout Canada, and things that you can do to take part in that whole mission here, because it's a big thing and it's important, and super stoked that we've got people so active and engaged in this. So yeah, thanks everybody for tuning in. Doesn't look like we have any more questions, so hasta luego, and I hope to catch you all later. Now please enjoy me awkwardly figuring out how to end this thing. Oh, there's a button here. Okay, cool. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope to catch you next time on some sort of nature walk thing in the future.